part one of our study on 2 Corinthians. I'm Amber, and this week we're going to be reading 2 Corinthians chapters 1 through 7. I'm really excited because there's lots of good stuff here. Paul is the author of 2 Corinthians. He writes 2 Corinthians around AD 55 from the region of Macedonia, which is in Greece. 2 Corinthians happens to contain the most autobiographical, I have to be very clear when I say that word, otherwise I get super tongue-tied, autobiographical information on Paul. And we'll see why that is here in just a little bit. As we learned from Ashley in the previous weeks in our study of 1 Corinthians, Paul established the Corinth church on his second missionary journey. From reading through 1 Corinthians, we can see that from the very beginning, the church in Corinth was a little bit of an issue for Paul. They had divisions, they struggled with sexual immorality, they had devotion to false teachers. They just created quite a bit of problem. In fact, so much problem that it's believed that Paul had to write 4 separate letters and pay a personal visit in order to resolve some of these issues. Now, the first letter that he wrote to the Corinthians is referenced actually in 1 Corinthians. It comes before 1 Corinthians. It's referenced in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. And the letter addresses some issues of sexual immorality. It's encouraging the Corinthians to not associate themselves with the sexually immoral. Specifically, people who were claiming to be believers or Christians and still living in sexual immorality. Paul then follows up this letter with 1 Corinthians, where he addresses sexual immorality more, as well as answers some different questions that the Corinthians had. And we just finished reading that, so that should be familiar. Now, the letter of 1 Corinthians doesn't exactly bring about all of the things that Paul hoped it would in the hearts of the Corinthian believers. And a group of men come to Corinth and start claiming to be apostles themselves. And they start questioning both the integrity and the apostleship of Paul. Now, these men happen to be very wealthy and very eloquent. And so a large number of the believers in Corinth were swayed by these men. When Paul gets word of this, he is very disheartened, and he actually leaves Ephesus where he was and goes to Corinth in order to address this issue, but it doesn't go very well for him. So he returns to Ephesus and then writes what is called the severe letter, and it's referenced in 2 Corinthians 2 verses 3 through 4. Paul then moves on to Macedonia, and he's reunited with Titus there and is very encouraged because Titus informs him that that severe letter that Paul wrote did reach the hearts of the Corinthians, and their eyes were opened to these false teachers, and they reject them. So Paul, being very encouraged, immediately pens 2 Corinthians. And we see that 2 Corinthians picks up, and he's very excited to be reconciled with the Corinthian church. And some of that language is very visible in the first couple chapters of 2 Corinthians. But Paul, being the teacher that he is, as well as being one to always keep his eyes on what is most important, doesn't just let the fact that the Corinthian church had rejected him slide by. Now, he doesn't hold on to it for any begrudging reason, but he uses it as a teaching tool. The Corinthians had rejected Paul mostly because of superficial reasons, and that becomes clear as you read through 2 Corinthians, the reasons why they had rejected Paul. These false teachers had convinced the Corinthians that Paul was unworthy because he earned his living through manual labor. He wasn't a very impressive speaker. He often was homeless. He suffered a lot. How can somebody who's leading you suffer so much? So this caused the Corinthians, I keep wanting to call them the 2 Corinthians, this caused the Corinthians to question Paul. Like, yeah, he's actually not that impressive. Wow, maybe we shouldn't be listening to what this guy has to say. Now, this might seem weird to us because we regard Paul as someone who is deeply respect worthy, who is a hero of the faith. And so to think that the Corinthians rejected him is kind of baffling. But in that day, in real time, they wanted an eloquent, wealthy leader. This revealed a distortion in their value system. And Paul had to convince and show them that true Christian leadership is not about status. So as you read the first half of 2 Corinthians, I want you to be very aware of a lot of the lowly language that Paul uses in order to help drive this point home. You'll read words like captive and slaves. You'll read quite a bit about suffering and the examples that he uses and how this can be a good thing when we're suffering for the cause of Christ. Because Paul really wants to help the Corinthians to get over themselves and to have the proper perspective. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 5 through 9, I'm going to read that for us because it's a really good example of this language. This is from the Amplified Translation, and it reads, "For we do not preach ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves merely as bondservants for Christ's sake. For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' is the one who is shown in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory and majesty of God, revealed in the face of Christ. But we have this precious treasure, the good news about salvation, in unworthy earthen vessels of human frailty, so that the grandeur and surpassing greatness of the power will be shown to be from God, not from ourselves. We are pressed in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, hunted down and persecuted, but not deserted, struck down, but never destroyed." We can see very clear examples in this reading of that lowly language that Paul's pointing to the fact that it is not ourselves that make us great, but it is Christ through us. It is God through us. It is what he has planted in us, this great news, or this good news, this message of salvation through Jesus Christ that makes us glorious. It's nothing about these vessels. These vessels are just earthen. They're human, they're frail. Paul wants the Corinthians to see that the job of a Christian is not to be impressive, but to point to the one who is, and that is Jesus. But if I'm being honest, I'm sometimes guilty of the Corinthians' status standards. We'll have a guest speaker at church, and I'll let them get a few minutes into their sermon before I make my judgment whether or not I'm going to tune in. I'm not actively listening to them, searching for God's truths or what it is that God might be wanting me to learn from them. I'm judging whether or not I think they're worthy to teach me. Talk about pride. That is not the right perspective at all. It's also not hard for me to see a lot of the Corinthian church in our modern church. In our Instagram world, we don't just want a pastor to be able to deliver us truth-filled messages, but the message needs to be tweetable. It needs to have a clever title, and don't forget that flashy intro video in order to get my attention. Would we let a man who's homeless for the sake of the gospel grace our pulpit? And if Paul was alive today, would he make the cut to be able to speak at our churches? Or would we judge him and turn him away because he wasn't impressive enough? We need to make sure we aren't allowing flashy titles and fancy resumes impress us more than the Word of God. We need to be more interested in God's truths than the vessels that are delivering them. We don't want to fall into the same mindset that the Corinthians had.